am Anthony, and I am here. I am life, not the resurrection. I am from the pure house, not heaven. I have been here telling you that things ain't correct. Our religions have been manipulated. There should only be one religion, and this religion is purity. It is until the people become a pure breed of people that we will be free and happy, and we will learn how to live amongst each other with no racism going on. I have also shown you the symbol of purity. The symbol of purity is a tough one. You could search it up, and it's almost as if they have tried to erase it from people knowing these symbols. Well, I have been here and I have been speaking, showing you, telling you, and never did I realize that I was even speaking against evolution. Evolution, for those that believe in it, it is false. Humans were created in an image of other beings from other worlds. We weren't created from monkeys. Scientists have proven that DNA from a tree, it is within a human body. The vibrations of a rock are the same as a human body. The same vibrations that come out of a human body can be found in a rock. So, I am telling you, my people have been misled, and it is now time for you to know our past. Because rioting, burning buildings, defunding police, what is that going to do but create more of a problem? We need our police. We don't need the racism. But in order to fight racism, you got to fight it from within. Now, what does that mean? That means within ourselves. That means we must learn the true nature of this world of life. Not what we have been taught to learn, because what we have been taught to learn is all false. Our religions have been manipulated, as I am telling you. So now I have put something together to enlighten my people, to put you on a path of knowing what it is we should be fighting for, what we should be standing up for, and what we should be fighting against. Because I truly believe that this is still going on till this day. I believe people live by these codes, and they try to keep it from us as if they don't. Well, here it is.
Organizers imported thousands of indigenous peoples from around the world to be put on public display in what was essentially a giant human zoo. Unlike freak shows, the Human Zoo in St. Louis was created with the cooperation of America's scientific establishment. The man behind the Human Zoo was anthropologist William McGee. One of the nation's leading scientists, McGee had already served as acting president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 1903, he was asked to head the anthropology department for the World's Fair. McGee had grand plans of presenting the story of human evolution by displaying representatives of what he considered lower stages of the human race. Ernst Haeckel helped popularize the idea.
Ernst Haeckel was the leading German Darwinist in the late 19th and early 20th century. He corresponded extensively with Darwin, and Darwin recognized Haeckel's affinity with his own theory.
Ernst Haeckel also is known for his raving racism. And in fact, he had a graphic of the history of human evolution that, in very pointed terms, really embedded a racist view of human evolution. You had the Teutonic male on the top, the sort of the Germanic male, and then at the bottom you had some creatures that looked partly like apes, partly like Jews. He was also anti-Semitic. And in the middle, you have the transition from the ape-like creatures to the first human creatures. The ape-like creatures look pretty much like they're Africans. And the takeaway point that Ernst Haeckel had from this graph was that the difference between the highest human being and the lowest human being, the gap between the highest Teutonic male and the first human being that was just one step above the apes, was larger than the gap between the lowest human being and the highest ape.
The savage stands strikingly close to subhuman species in every aspect of mentality, as well as in bodily habits and bodily structure.
McGee was determined to use primitive peoples at the fair to dramatize for the public the different stages of human evolution, beginning with races he considered lowest on the evolutionary scale. McGee arranged for native peoples to be put on display in villages designed to recreate their native habitats. These villages were enclosed by fences, making them truly seem like human zoos. More than 4 million fairgoers reportedly visited these anthropological displays, eagerly staring at and poking at the indigenous peoples in their enclosures. Adding to the indignities, native peoples were pressured to participate in a series of athletic contests designed to show they were biologically inferior to whites. Those on display were also subjected to experiments in a special laboratory set up by the fair's anthropology department. Directed by a psychology professor from Columbia University, the lab conducted tests to measure native people's intelligence and physical features, and even their threshold for pain.
Will the pygmies brought last week to the World's Fair prove Darwin's theory of the missing link? Will a study of the little black children of the African jungles shed light on the theory evolved by Darwin as regards the evolution of the human race? Dr. W.J. McGee, chief of the anthropology department of the World's Fair, is convinced that it will. This is the first time that the Aboriginal people of Africa have been brought to an English-speaking country. This is the first opportunity that has been presented to scientists to study them. Many characteristics were noticed in the pygmies that closely resemble the ape or the simian type. It is believed that the pygmies, who are said to represent the lowest form of human development, are next removed from the simian family.
The goal of finding pygmies to display at the fair.
He had gone to the Congo heavily armed, and he had gone hunting for these people he called pygmies, these diminutive people of the Central African forest.
The fair's anthropologist William McGee repeatedly compared the pygmies to monkeys and apes. In the journal Science, he even asserted that pygmies were commonly considered to approach subhuman types more closely than any other variety of the genus Homo.
They were considered by men of science at that time to be the lowest form of humans, or in some thought they were subhuman.
The pygmies were less than thrilled by their welcome at the fair.
The Americans treat us as they do our pet monkey. They laugh at us and poke their umbrellas into our faces. They do the same to our monkey.
One pygmy at the fair became a special celebrity. His name was Ota Benga. Samuel Werner had purchased him at a slave market, more than just animals at their new zoo. Both wanted to install Native Americans on zoo grounds, with Osborne promising that one day the Indian and his teepee would take their place next to the zoological park's buffalo. Now they had their chance to put their first human on display. Hornaday quickly agreed to purchase one of Werner's chimpanzees and to house both the chimp and Ota Benga at the zoo. Hornaday planned to exhibit the pygmy and the chimpanzee together in a cage in the zoo's monkey house.
It was presented as science, not as a circus act, because these were men of science who were doing this.
Ota Benga went on display in the monkey house on Saturday, September the 8th, 1906. The next day, a sign was placed on the cage explaining the new exhibit.
The African Pygmy, Ota Benga. Age 23 years. Height 4 feet 11 inches. Weight 103 pounds. Brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State. Exhibited each afternoon during September.
Thousands of New Yorkers came to stare and laugh and debate the meaning of the display. Is it a man? Some of them wondered. Newspaper coverage brought even more people, and in just a few weeks, the zoo drew nearly 250,000 visitors. But the notoriety also brought controversy. New York's clergy, in particular, were horrified at what they saw as a dehumanizing spectacle. First to speak out was the Reverend Robert Stewart MacArthur, pastor of the city's Calvary Baptist Church, one of the largest Baptist congregations in America. Protest committee. After visiting the zoo and seeing Benga for themselves, they were horrified.
They thought it was outrageous. They clearly saw a human being who appeared to be afraid, who was being heckled and jeered at and things thrown at him, and he was being, debased on the hallowed grounds of the New York Zoological Society in New York City.
The ministers demanded that Ota Benga be taken off display and be offered an education. James H. Gordon, superintendent of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, appealed to the zoo to end the spectacle.
If Professor Werner found difficulty in disposing of the boy, why did he not apply to us? We would have seen that he was well cared for.
Gordon also denounced the way the young African was being used as a prop to prove Darwinian evolution.
This is a Christian country, and the exhibition evidently aims to be a demonstration of the Darwinian theory of evolution. The Darwinian theory of evolution absolutely is opposed to Christianity, and a public demonstration in its favor should not be permitted. Neither the Negro nor the white man is related to the monkey. Such an exhibition only degrades a human being's manhood. We do not like this exhibition of one of our race with the monkeys. Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls.
Hornaday made clear that he wasn't about to shut down the popular exhibit.
The exhibition shall certainly be continued unless the directors of the park decide otherwise.
But the leaders of the New York Zoological Society were pleased by the display. Henry Fairfield Osborn even congratulated Hornaday for the excellent press coverage, commenting that Benga is certainly making his way successfully as a sensation. Spurned by Hornaday, the African-American ministers decided to appeal to George McClellan Jr., the Democratic mayor of New York. McClellan was the son of the controversial general during the Civil War who had tried to unseat Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election of 1864. The elder McClellan openly confessed that he was prejudiced in favor of the white race and said that he couldn't learn to like the odor of either billy goats or Negroes. The younger McClellan now refused to even meet with the African-American ministers, sending out an assistant with a dismissive note referring them to the New York Zoological Society. The ministers then went to see Madison Grant, the Zoological Society's secretary.
Colored brother should be told that evolution, in one form or another, is now taught in the textbooks of all the schools, and that it is no more debatable than the multiplication table.
As protests continued, increasingly rowdy crowds came to the zoo in order to visit the pygmy. On Sunday, September 16th, 40,000 people converged on zoo grounds to see the city's newest sensation. According to press reports, the mobs chased Ota Benga around the zoo all day, howling, jeering and yelling. Some of them poked him in the ribs, others tripped him. All laughed at him. Benga responded by shooting an arrow at his tormentors, after which zookeepers caught him and returned him to his cage. Benga had expressed a desire to return to his native Africa, but by 1916, the continent was being further ravaged by European powers as they fought World War I, so return was no longer an option.
I think the hopelessness of it all, the trauma he had sustained, the loneliness, and I can't even imagine. He had no idea what had become of his people, if his village was still even there. So it's not hard to imagine the myriad reasons why he would have sunk into this deep depression and that ultimately caused him to take his life.
In one final indignity, the New York Times published an obituary assuring readers that during Ota Benga's stay in their city, he was actually an employee of the Bronx Zoo who had been hired to feed the apes. According to the Times, it was this employment that gave rise to the unfounded report that Ota Benga was being held in the park as one of the exhibits in the monkey cage. Ota Benga was largely forgotten by history until the 1990s. But the passion of social Darwinists in America for putting humans on display continued. And 15 years later, some of the same figures involved in the Ota Benga scandal would be involved in another kind of human display, one whose impact would prove even more horrifying. Museum of Natural History in New York City for the Second International Congress of Eugenics. Eugenics was the science of breeding better people. The term had been coined by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. But Darwin himself helped lay the groundwork for eugenics in his book, The Descent of Man. According to Darwin, human beings developed through a long and cruel process of natural selection or survival of the fittest. Less fit organisms died, leaving more capable organisms to reproduce and flourish. It was this ruthless process of elimination, not the foresight of a designer, that had propelled human beings to the top of the evolutionary ladder. But Darwin worried that modern society was now doing its best to undermine natural selection.
We civilized men do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands. The breeding of domestic animals would doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed.
Implications of his theory for society. But his followers had a solution. They thought they could apply Darwinian selection rationally and humanely through the science of eugenics, which became known as the self-direction of human evolution. Eugenics was eagerly embraced by America's scientific elites.
Sometimes today it's argued that eugenics was just fringe science, just a few people believed in it, and of course we don't believe in it now. That ignores the fact that for decades, eugenics was what could be called the consensus view of the scientific community.
The Eugenics Congress at the American Museum of Natural History drew scientists from America's top research institutions, including Harvard, Yale, MIT, the Smithsonian, Ohio State, UC Berkeley, and the University of Texas. Participants included inventor Alexander Graham Bell. Scientists were welcomed to the Eugenics Congress by then President of the American Museum of Natural History, Henry Fairfield Osborn, who had been involved in the display of Ota Benga at the Bronx Zoo. A future head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Osborn had become one of the most celebrated scientific champions of evolution in America. Soon he would become embroiled in a controversy with politician William Jennings Bryan over a fossilized tooth discovered in Nebraska. Osborn insisted that the tooth supplied irrefutable evidence of the existence of man-like apes in ancient North America. To his embarrassment, the tooth later turned out to be part of an extinct pig. At the Eugenics Congress, Osborn told scientists that eugenics was essential to the future of human evolution.
To know the worst as well as the best in heredity, to preserve and to select the best, these are the most essential forces in the future evolution of human society.
Osborne also attacked racial intermarriage.
500,000 years of human evolution have impressed certain distinctive virtues as well as faults on each race. Put three races together, you are likely to unite the vices of all three as the virtues.
Osborne argued that racial groups should be studied to determine what tasks each race is best fitted to accomplish. But it was clear that he already thought he knew the proper place of non-whites. Stoddard had published The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. Stoddard claimed that whites were in danger of being overrun by the colored races of the world, and he argued that immigration from what he called lower human types had to be rigorously curtailed.
Eugenists pretty universally viewed immigrants and people of non-white races as a drag on the human race. Eugenists viewed blacks and Mexicans and Hispanics as throwbacks, evolutionary throwbacks that were lower races in evolutionary terms and therefore were a drain on modern society. And they justified this in the name of Darwinian science. You know, there were racists before the eugenists. The interesting thing about the eugenists was the way that they built on top of Darwinian biology and claimed that there was a scientific justification for racism.
The eugenics exhibition advocated a chilling agenda for public policy, including forced sterilization and harsh new restrictions on immigration. The American Museum of Natural History later called the Eugenics Congress of 1921 perhaps the most important scientific meeting ever held in the museum. A decade later, the museum was at it again, hosting the Third International Congress of Eugenics in 1932. This time, it put on an even more extensive museum exhibition for the public. At the entrance to the exhibit hall were placed the busts of two men accredited as the founding fathers of eugenics, Francis Galton and Charles Darwin.
It's a story that Americans don't know as well as they should, and it's a story that American Christians don't know as well as they should. But at the basis of opposition to the so-called scientific eugenicist movement in the early 20th century were Christians, Protestants, Baptists, Catholics, who understood the value of every human being. That's not only a Christian value, that is fundamental to the American experiment itself.
When Nebraska's legislature passed a forced sterilization bill in 1913, Governor John Moorhead, a Presbyterian, vetoed it. Moorhead argued that the legislation not only violated the state's Bill of Rights, it also offended a higher law.
This proposed legislation seems more in keeping with the pagan age than with the teachings of Christianity. Man is more than an animal.
While many modernist clergy supported eugenics, theologically conservative religious figures were much more skeptical. American evangelical William Jennings Bryan, for example, denounced eugenics as an impossible system for scientific breeding under which a few supposedly superior intellects, self-appointed, would direct the mating and the movements of the mass of mankind. But the most consistent opposition to eugenics came from Roman Catholics. In 1930, Pope Pius XI strongly condemned forced sterilization for eugenics in one of his encyclicals. The Pope criticized eugenists for asking the government to assume a power which it can never legitimately possess.
The most fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching is the intrinsic dignity of every human being. In other words, people are valuable simply as creatures made in the image and likeness of God. They're not valuable merely because they have economic value or they're productive or they're smart. They have value in and of themselves as spiritual creatures made in God's image. That idea obviously contradicts the fundamental principle of eugenics, which is through either passive or active means to favor particular ethnic groups over others.
Across America, Catholic clergy actively resisted the eugenics crusade. In Louisiana, the Catholic Church played a key role in preventing the passage of a sterilization law. Catholic opposition to eugenics was so pronounced that some eugenics groups targeted the Catholic Church for attacks. The Human Betterment Foundation in California was dedicated to promoting eugenics through forced sterilization. Its president, E.S. Gosney, lashed out at Catholic efforts to block sterilization laws.
Every legislature considering a sterilization bill in the United States is visited by representatives of the bishop or archbishop who lay down the law of Rome to those willing to accept it. The henchmen are prompt to fall in line.
Gosney suggested that the Catholic Church should be asked to pay for Catholics who aren't sterilized.
If Catholics do not want their feeble-minded communicants sterilized, it would seem more logical to ask them, as Hitler has done in Germany, to keep these feeble-minded segregated at their own expense, in order that the American Commonwealth may be subjected to no unnecessary damage from the presence of a great body of defectives, who increase the amount of human misery, contribute largely to the ranks of the delinquent and criminal, augment the tax burdens, diminish the efficiency of industry, and dilute the quality of American citizenship.
The eugenics movement and the supporters of eugenics in the early 20th century actually tried to make an anti-Catholic campaign part of their public argument. On the one hand, they claimed that their ideas were based firmly in natural science, and yet they actually ran a public campaign that was anti-religious. You get the impression that there was something more than simple empirical science at stake in the debate.
Despite opposition from Catholics and others, the American eugenics movement continued to flourish in the years leading up to World War II. The eugenics movement eventually led to the forced sterilization of more than 60,000 people in America. Compulsory sterilization in the name of eugenics was ultimately upheld by the United States Supreme Court in a decision that declared, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, needed in securing the passage of a draconian immigration law that sharply restricted the flow of non-Nordic ethnic groups into the United States. While considering the legislation, the United States Congress invited testimony by a leading eugenist on the biological aspects of immigration.
Starting in the 1920s in particular, there was a huge push for immigration restrictions on people who were coming from non-Germanic, non-Northern European countries. And so people coming from Mexico to the United States, or people coming from Africa or Southern European countries that had people that the eugenists viewed as evolutionarily backwards, they had to be stopped because they were going to destroy our society.
But the most horrifying implementation of eugenics policies took place not in America, but in Nazi Germany. The Nazis ultimately sterilized more than 300,000 supposed hereditary defectives in the name of eugenics. They then started gassing the disabled at special medical facilities. It was in these killing centers that the Nazis began to perfect the methods they would later use to exterminate Jews. The sordid history of eugenics and the mainstream scientific community's embrace of it remains completely unknown to many Americans. So does the scientific community's involvement with social Darwinism and scientific racism, including human zoos. It's a history some people are still trying to cover up.
I'm not asking you to take evolution out of the school. I am merely asking the legislature, the State Department of Education, the Board of Regents, and the state university systems that they be made aware that Darwin promoted the justification of racism in his definitive works on the origin of species by means of natural selection and the descent of man. I certainly understand that racism was in effect before Darwin. This has never been denied. Yet he was the originator of a scientific justification for racism, as well as giving wings to modern racism. Harvard University's Stephen Jay Gould wrote, quote, "Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory."
Broom's resolution provoked a firestorm, with supporters of Darwin's theory accusing her of trying to unfairly malign Charles Darwin.
This resolution is not only a product of creationists, but also Christian supremacists. And Christian supremacism is a hate-based ideology, and you can't combat hatred with hatred.
I never, ever has emulated any type of hate towards anyone.
The resolution only passed after all references to Darwin and Haeckel were deleted. It was as if scientific racism had never happened. Officials at the Bronx Zoo are likewise skittish when it comes to discussing its display of Ota Benga. They also refuse to be interviewed. And if you visit the zoo today, you won't find any remembrance of what happened to Ota Benga.
Instead, what they've done is they've closed off the monkey house. So where Ota Benga was housed, the public could not even see it now. And they have just not had any comment whatsoever.
It's as if zoo officials hope that Ota Benga and the scientific racism that dehumanized him will stay forgotten. Others seem to share the same hope. But some things should never be forgotten, because things that are forgotten have a way of coming back.
Nazi scum! Off our streets! Nazi scum! Off our streets!
The recent resurgence of white supremacist groups in America has raised chilling echoes of the past. Evolutionary arguments for racism that were rejected by the scientific community are now being resurrected by modern racists. In a 2017 study, more than 400 self-identified members of the alt-right revealed that they view blacks, Mexicans, and other racial and ethnic groups as less evolved and closer to humans' ape-like ancestors than whites. The misuse of science to promote racism is no longer just a sad relic of our history. It's also an uncomfortable part of our present. One reason we should remember the sins of the past is to help us avoid making the same mistakes again. We need to learn from the past, not cover it up.
So now it is through these beliefs that our world has been changed and manipulated. If our church could not stand up for us back then and actually fell into this trap that our government put, well, what makes you think that they are on the right path now? I say it's time for a change, and it's time to change the way we think about religion and everything else. I will tell you, we do need military and we do need police on these streets. But we do need to knock this racism down and everything else that is putting people down, period. We need to become a pure breed of people. Purity. That is it. So now I have a message for the Catholics, for the Pope. Now here it is. Step aside. You're on my seat. Get off of it. For what have you done for the world, for my people, besides mislead them and give them false hope and false prayers? For you, the church, have sinned against God himself, against this world. Now I am here to take my seat. Get off my seat.